Welcome to day 2 of CXC. We had a minor technical snafu, but we're ready to roll now. So without any further introduction, with a further introduction, let me introduce James Sturm. James is a cartoonist, and he's the founder of the Center for Cartoon Studies, a college for cartoonists in White River Junction, Vermont. His books include Off Season, Market Day, The Goblins' Mighty Swing. He has most recently worked on Health and Wealth, a graphic guide to the U.S. healthcare system, and is currently adapting Watership Down, the graphic novel with illustrator Joe Sutphin, who is, I believe, a Columbus person, correct? Or nearby. Yeah. James writes and draws from his home in Heartland, Vermont. So come on up, James.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody from Billy Ireland and everyone from the Crossroads team for organizing this amazing event. Really great to be here. And I'll kind of launch right into it. I'll start kind of like with the title. I think when Jared was like, how does this sound as a title? We were both kind of in the midst of a lot of stuff and it had to get done for the programming. So we're like, cartooning in the age of catastrophe. And it sounded okay, I guess. But of course, it's always been an age of catastrophe. You can walk over to the Still Racism in America exhibition right across the hall and see that 'twas ever thus. So in a way, I've been thinking about, if we had more time to kind of think about what this talk might have been called, I'm thinking more maybe something along the lines of like a cartoonist as citizen, perhaps. So in today's talk, it's a talk about teaching, teach and talk. So I'm gonna I'm not teaching right now at the cartoon school anymore in terms of taking a whole class, but I'm kind of overseeing projects with students from various schools, including CCS. So I thought I'd kind of talk about those projects and being a citizen cartoonist in a sense. I'll talk a little bit about the goals of these projects and then maybe walk us through a specific project and how we got from point A to point B. And then we can just open it up and talk about anything you want to talk about from funding models to future projects or whatever people are curious about. So I'll start with kind of when you go into any kind of class, you're thinking about the goals of the class. So when you're teaching cartoonists, of course, it's one of the goals is to make a book. These are these 4 graphic guides that we have made so far. Actually, there's a 5th that just arrived yesterday in White River Junction, one about civics and democracy in Vermont, freedom and unity. I found out that our state motto in Vermont, the initials, freedom and unity, is FU. So when New Hampshire raises their fists and says, live free or die, Vermont can say FU. So these are these kind of graphic guides that we've been making since 2016. I'll get into a little bit of the history in a second. But when we're putting these together, the goals are to make a book, and the cartoonist working on the book to grow as cartoonists. A second goal is the planning and implementation of the book's distribution as part of a broader public education campaign. This often involves coalition building with other organizations. Learning to work collaboratively, cross-disciplinary exploration, and even extending that a little more, kind of recognizing and honoring the various types of expertise that stakeholders bring to a project. That's, I think, more or less the goals of the book. And when I'm talking about these, and I'm kind of still in the middle of a lot of this and formulating my thoughts about, it's all very new to me still. But one of the things that I keep thinking about is the word agency. I think for a lot of cartoonists, creative people in general, making a comic, gives one a sense of agency, right? Especially as a kid, you don't have a lot of control over your life and what's going on. So you can, make these little boxes and, draw things in them and feel like you have some control over a world that's like falling apart. And definitely, I think everybody could, when you're looking at all these systems that seem to be failing all at once in our culture, working on these books and helping me understand these, bigger systems like the U.S. healthcare system certainly has given me, and I think my collaborators, a sense of that agency. And I think with a little bit of agency, then you feel a little bit empowered from there, even if it's just a little bit. So why don't I go to the next slide. So yeah, these are the first four books. It was this is what democracy looks like, graphic guide to governance. I'll talk about that one a little bit more. Let's talk about it, a graphic guide to mental health. Public health board in Stark County, Ohio, which is like next door, right? Like they saw the Democracy comic and contacted the school and said, could you do one about mental health for teens? So that was the second one. And then How We Read, a graphic guide to literacy, and then Health and Wealth. So this was the first one we did. I think we started in about 2016 when people were like, what the hell just happened? And, there were statistics that, like 75% of people in the country couldn't name all three branches of government, and, democracy under peril, but people couldn't even define democracy. So there was a recent graduate at CCS, Dan Knott, who was doing comics about hidden systems, electricity and water in cities, the internet, and he just graduated and finished his thesis project. And I said, hey Dan, do you want to collaborate on a book like this? I also reached out to Nomi Kane, who's doing stuff for the NIB, and we started thinking about this book, a graphic guide to governance. And we started, I mentioned the coalition building. There's a great Chicago nonprofit, the Mikveh Challenge, that works with social studies teachers throughout the country to get them thinking about civic engagement, democracy as a verb, as it were. And the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund as well, who worked with Diamond to create an edition that would be distributed, a free edition that could be given away at comic stores throughout the country. We did a Kickstarter that helped pay for a road trip that the Mikveh Challenge had an annual conference in Chicago where they bring social studies teachers all over the country. And myself and Coco Fox, who's a recent graduate of CCS, we went there and we kind of created a presentation, graphic facilitation around the book. And then we gave it to social studies teachers and said, how useful is this? And they gave us feedback, and we fine-tuned it, and then the Mikveh Challenge helped us get into schools in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. And I think the very first event might have been in Indiana, or was it Ohio? But there's Dan and Coco, and we visited schools throughout, doing these kind of like whiteboard storytelling facilitated conversations. I think, there I am, Wisconsin. I am a Badger, proudly. Nothing against other Big Ten schools, of course. Here I am. Love this place. So that was a really, it felt really, empowering. The book got out there in the world. With all these projects, you might need an electronic microscope to see how far you move the needle in any direction, but hopefully everybody moves the needle like a couple micromillimeters, right? So after doing that project, I got a Radcliffe Fellowship, and which was virtual because of the pandemic. And I applied to do a graphic guide of the U.S. healthcare system. I thought, trying to tell the story of democracy and in governance in higher U.S. democracy in 32 pages wasn't challenging enough. So if anybody can figure out the U.S. healthcare system, let's try it, right? So the way this would work is I knew probably as much as anybody who interfaces with the U.S. healthcare system, no expert, listened to maybe some podcasts over the years, frustrated, and really wanted to learn how we got here, knowing it was awful. And I should say I chose the subject too because of some statistics I was reading. Like, this is the #1 issue that affects all Americans, and that they feel they want their politicians to address. And everybody interfaces with the U.S. healthcare system at one point or another. So I got accepted to this Radcliffe Fellowship. There was a Sam Nakahira, who was a really great student at CCS. She joined a team as an assistant, and we had all these 5 Harvard students, and we started meeting once a week online during the pandemic. And so this was kind of in some ways like a class, but but we had this goal, which I listed all those goals earlier. And we started. I'll just kind of walk us through kind of the process. We started just by creating a reading list just to get us all up to speed, to do like a deeper dive. So, the seminar is reading list: American Sickness, Paul Starr's Social Transformation of American Medicine, and the Kaiser Family Foundation website, which is just tons of really wonderful statistics about the U.S. healthcare system. And we just kind of tried to intake as much information as possible. And after a few weeks of this, and there was other stuff, we set up a Slack channel, listen to this podcast, check out this article, et cetera, et cetera. So then what I did is I asked everybody, like, over the next week to independently just create like a book map. And I should say, Sam was a cartoonist, I was a cartoonist. One of the Harvard students had aspirations of being a cartoonist. But other people weren't cartoonists, but they were game, right? So I said, everyone create a book map, and you can write it out if you want, and give the comic book a title, arrange the information as you see fit, and we had 5 of these book maps, 6 actually with Sam's as well, I should say, and from there it was really interesting to see where we overlapped, what we all emphasized. Comparing and contrasting. And we are also looking at how do we share this information, right? So of course, Google everything. So navigating healthcare, we saw these kind of graphics that were online. We saw Hellmouth. Who drew that? I want to say who did Art, I think that's an Art Young, at least the one on the right, which has a white stripe through it for some reason. But I think that's Art Young. And we also started sharing books and reading, things that had a vibe that we wanted, so to speak. David B's Epileptic. All right. There's a little something going on here. All right, I think we might be. We're back. We'll figure it out, or I'll just wing it if we don't have the slides. And we started getting all these snake iconography, and looking at old prints. We kind of had a big, organizing all this information is a challenge in and of itself. So creating, a shared Dropbox folder with we had one folder that was just here's stuff that's cool that has to do with medicine that, even if we can't articulate why we like it or where it fits, you throw it in there, right? Because we're still just trying to figure out, there's connections that you're telling a story, but you're also just kind of going with almost your gut a little bit, what's attractive to you. One of the things that we all really liked is this Richard Scarry thing going on, and how do you explain something really complicated and do it really simply. And Richard Scarry is a master of that. And the joke was we want to create something too that, because we were talking about how politicians, we want to kind of almost convince politicians to take action. That was that stat I mentioned earlier. But how do we, so the idea was to create something so simple that even a politician could understand it. And a visit to the hospital. This was really interesting, and I just want to read one thing that goes along with this. Find this. There was this scholar who analyzed nearly 300 children's books and found that there was a marked tendency in these texts to represent certain animals and particular kinds of jobs. Jobs that allow the occupant to exercise authority over others tend to be held by predatory animals, especially foxes, but never by lower animals, mice or pigs. So in effect, there's this hidden language or code inscribed in children's books which teaches kids to view inequalities within the division of labor as a natural fact of life. That is, as a reflection of the inherent characteristics of the workers themselves. Young readers, without realizing it, of course, that some species beings are simply better equipped to hold manual or service jobs, while other creatures ought to be professionals. Once this code is acquired by preschool children, he suggests it becomes exceedingly difficult to unlearn. And as adults, then we are already predisposed to accept the hierarchical caste-based system of labor that characterizes the American workplace. So, we stumbled upon that as well, and that really changed our thinking of being very conscious of what animals are doing what jobs, in the comic book. So we put that on our radar as well. And these are all, images, histories of the U.S. hospital. Medicare that came out in the 60s, out of the civil rights movement. And then, every time I went to the doctor now, I just kept saving my intake forms as well, thinking that could be helpful as well. And then one of the students, I think it might have been, they brought this to the table, that when we think about the symbols of the U.S. healthcare system, we think of the staff of Hermes, the two snakes. But the staff of Hermes is like the god of commerce and trickery and commerce, whereas the rod of Asclepius, I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing that wrong. Asclepius, thank you. Is that the single snake is the god of healing and medicine, and suddenly that story. That one of the students told became almost like the organizing principle of these two snakes, one of healing and one of commerce, which seemed like a good way to tell the story of the U.S. healthcare system. So we had this folder of all these images. We read all this stuff. We had these book maps. So then at that point, I took all those book maps, and then I did my book map, trying to weave together everybody's various book maps. And this was, basically my book map proto working draft. God bless you. And this is just 8.5 by 11. Dip a brush in an inkwell and go. It was interesting too, talking to younger students. People remember the Harper's Index? Yeah, so the Harper's Index is from Harper's Magazine. It was just a list of statistics, but it would tell a story, and often very kind of in a very clever, interesting way, juxtaposing various statistics. And they're like, what is that? And it's like, well, let's look at that. And could we do something like that? It didn't work out, but that was the idea. And this was an initial draft of each spread, and then plugging things in. And then, kind of wrap, I don't think you can talk, this is obviously for a moral issue at its heart. So at the end, we decided to tell it as a fable, kind of to wrap it up. And because with the two snakes, we told the story. It's interesting how it was really actually very comforting. The ending of the book, even in this rough sketch, you'll see as it goes through all the various permutations, basically stayed the same. even on the earliest draft. And we tried to figure out a way to. Also, I think a lot of these books can be very depressing when you're talking about the healthcare system, and you want to show a way forward or places where you there's a little light, and it's at the end of the tunnel, and it's not an oncoming train. And then a glossary of terms. It's really funny. We wound up doing a pretty nice glossary of terms in the book, but I was on the Dartmouth Hitchcock, and I was trying to find something, and I saw, oh, there's a glossary on this, DHMC's, website, which is a huge medical hospital system, and it was like 6. The glossary was like 6 terms, and it was buried, and you could barely find it. And then that's the rest of it. So I talked about this whole thing about coalition building. I think about, I definitely think about the reader differently than when I think about when I do my own kind of personal graphic novels. Like it's like there's a woman named Haley J. Pope, who's a really good cartoonist who does something called the Graphic Advocacy Project, and she once called the readers of her comics users, right? Like ICE is knocking on your door. What do you do? And her comics help tell people here's an instruction manual at this point, at this juncture. So we started, once we started the project rolling, I talked about that coalition building. We reached out to Physicians for a National Healthcare Program, which is a really amazing organization that has doctors throughout the country. Will you read a draft? Will you look at it? Would you maybe consider helping us distribute it and getting the word out? We felt like their goals aligned with ours. And then, of course, the wonderful Graphic Medicine organization. They were very helpful in distributing it as well during their annual conference. So after that first draft that I just showed you, we all step back. How do we start filling these things in? What does it look like? We get some feedback from folks, and then people start working on pages, and then they slowly start, another draft starts coming together. A Tale of Two Snakes and Other Stories, all the forums that we found on the internet, and shared it with some of the fellows I was with. There was a fellow, Thea Riafranco, who had done a book on climate change, and she had shared a chapter. She suggested, what could healthcare be? Why don't you lay out that vision in the beginning? And that could be a nice in. So I thought that was a really good advice to kind of kick us off. So here's some just basic draft of the book, so you can see how much it's already changed. At this point, we have Healthcare the Game. Thinking about healthcare is like all these different games that are all mashed together, and all the rules are different, and you're not given the instruction manual, or in fact, it's hidden and they won't even share it with you. So we started thinking about that, and at one point we thought, well, maybe we could on the end papers or actually make the game. So at one point, several of the students went off and actually designed a healthcare game, and that was kind of fun. And there was a lot of creative dead ends, and sometimes the game didn't work out for the comic, but there was resources online that you can download, and that kind of got incorporated into some of that. So that was kind of cool. And as you can see, we're just starting to block things in. I grabbing things off the internet and just putting them in, and we'll figure out how that gets drawn later, kind of thing. Some pages didn't change from draft to draft. Brief story of the U.S. hospital. Cool thing about cartooning too, even if my hope is that even if you don't read any of the text, you can see these kind of old-timey drawings, and then and see how the hospital starts growing till I wanted it to feel like the Death Star by the time you got to this big huge panel at the end. So we started kind of blocking that in as well. Health insurance and how you pay for it. I love drawing. One of my favorite. I have a really soft spot. I miss the yellow pages because I used to love seeing all the mascots in the yellow pages, and they were always drawn by like, oh yeah, you should ask, that guy's uncle who works here. He likes to cartoon, and they would draw a little muffler and put it in the yellow pages ad. Like the mascots were so awesome, and I always try to fit them into comics somehow or another. There's a little muffler. And again, sometimes we haven't figured out. This was when you're talking about racism in the U.S. healthcare system, it felt wrong just to have like, let's just do a little section about this on these pages. Like, since it affects the entire system, we decided we needed to like not kind of have that section of it, but that just kind of permeating the whole book. But these are all conversations every week we would meet, and it was really nice during the pandemic actually to kind of have a standing Friday meeting where we could all, somebody was in LA, somebody was in Montana, somebody was in Maine, a couple people were in, I was in Vermont, of course, East Coast. Here's some SAM pages, kind of trying to figure out Medicare, civil rights movement that she contributed. And then this kind of stayed put. And then after we got this done, we kept sharing it with folks. I actually shared it with Gary Trudeau, and he had 2 pieces of advice. He said, never put snakes on the cover. I don't know why. I mean, that part I didn't listen to because I really felt that the whole theme was the snake thing. But he's like, you need a table of contents. And the book was filling up so fast, so we actually wound up putting the table of contents. I thought that was a really good suggestion, and we put the table of contents on the cover, and started thinking through how this would work. And we started, going through this again. You can see like some of this, the writing, and even this page gets a little tighter. This is the one panel that got cut in a way, or some of my drawing. The one piece of drawing that I actually liked of mine was the Bernie Sanders as an orangutan and Mitch McConnell as a turtle. I actually thought that was a pretty good Mitch McConnell, pretty good Bernie. U.S. hospital that you've seen. Everything starts getting a little tighter, a little tighter, a little tighter. Yeah, Harry Truman's favorite animal was a mule. That's a really horrible mule right there, but you'll see, we got that. And then you can see that lower panel. That's like a layout from a David B. panel that we kind of incorporated into the comic. We try to this photo collage thing, and again, using kind of folk tales to tell a story. Who deserves health care? So we used the ant and the grasshopper. I think this was something, if I recall correctly, one of our students was referencing Atul Gawande's writing, who's the surgeon who writes for the New Yorker brilliantly about healthcare. And we talked about the ant and the grasshopper, and figured that in. And Tell It to Snakes kind of got a little tighter. So again, after every draft, we share it with people. For feedback. We got getting some resources, some glossary, some of the design keeps coming together. From beginning to end, I should say this comic took about a year to make. And going from here, so at one point, I had worked with Casimir Lee, if you're familiar with their work. They illustrated Whit Taylor's Harriet Tubman book that CCS created, a graphic novel biography, and we had talked about the graphic guides, and I'd done a couple of drafts of this, and Kaz reached out to me and said, you had mentioned the graphic guides. I'd love to keep working with you, and do you have anything up your sleeve? And I said, do you like Lily the Worm? And Kaz was like, I almost got a Lily the Worm tattoo. And I said, very good, let's talk. So Kaz's facility for drawing is like off the charts. And it's funny, like as I was looking at Schoolhouse Rock and Richard Scarry, I knew if I drew it, like by the time I drew it, everything would look weird and wonky, Kaz like drew so close on model that it kind of made me a little nervous, like with the Richard Scarry imagery. But Kaz jumped on board, and what would have taken me another year to draw because I'm slow. Kaz did in a matter of months, and just did so many wonderful improvements. So, and as we're doing all this, part of this is like, how are we going to pay for it? How do we, the joke about sending it to every member of Congress, we're like, well, let's do that. So we created a GoFundMe page collectively. GoFundMe can't fix healthcare. We came across this statistic that most, I think, GoFundMe, somehow pays for more healthcare in the country than like Blue Cross Blue Shield, something crazy like that. And the statistics are just mind-boggling. They boggle the mind. So we put up this GoFundMe Can't Fix Healthcare to pay for the comic, and then to send one to every member of Congress. And it was really, again, everybody. We wrote a script, we created a video, and I'd only done one other one. We did we did a Kickstarter for the Democracy book. Thank you, Alec, for helping with that. So I had, this is all new to me too, which makes it exciting as a teacher. When you're thinking about as a teacher doing this stuff, like you just learn a ton of stuff. And it's nice to be in a position where you're just not the expert on healthcare, on a lot of this work. I mean, I barely consider myself an expert on cartooning. So we put together this GoFundMe in the meantime and started raising some money. And I think our original goal was like $3,000 to print and get it out there, and we did pretty good. So and we wound up we were all apart, and then the book finally got published, and then I met everybody. I went to Cambridge and met all of my team. We were all in person for the first time, and then spent like a morning like stuffing envelopes, like old school, and then taking that to the post office, and off they went to Congress, and I'm sure they're going to do something right. Like that's power of comics. And then I guess this is the kind of final Kaz, or almost final. This is an uncorrected advanced preview. Okay, things go overboard and things get simplified, and it's really I find the drawing quite delightful. One of my readers was Scott McCloud, and he had a lot of good advice about kind of not feeling like every page spread was like a different handout, and thinking about rhetorical metaphors versus structural metaphors. And it was nice. Kaz's hand really evened everything out, and especially that photo thing. And I understand why my drawings of these characters had to go, because it had to be unified. But I still miss my Bernie Sanders. And then, drawing all the photos, all made it feel of a piece as well. And Kaz suggested doing this cutaway view, which is really, really quite brilliant. And what I think one of the things we discover with these graphic guides, there's a certain amount of information you're trying to get across, but there is like the vibe of the book is almost just as important, if nothing else. It's almost like you want to just get people in through the door and just kind of engage with the material to whatever level they're comfortable engaging with it, and hopefully that's enough for them to like keep moving, and learning in that subject. And you can see that Truman mule was a lot better in that drawing. And then figuring out how to incorporate these photos in a way that was respectful of the photos, but also of a piece with the book, with the whole book. And it's fun. It's really really fun having these weekly production meetings as well. Here's the Ant and the Grasshopper fable all done. And what's really cool is there's now a gallery show at the Radcliffe Gallery on campus. At Harvard, and they're highlighting all these graphic guides as part of this exhibition, which is super cool, and getting some wonderful feedback on that level as well. And is that one of those? And and then this is the book that just like dropped today, and we're, all those things. trying to figure out how to get these out in the world in kind of like a model that creating cartooning that actually, and this is maybe something we can talk about if you want. I'm going to open up the questions in a second, but funding for this. But some of these projects you do because it's like you have a cartoonist who's really interested in it and you just kind of start it, or you bring people together and you hope, you build it and you hope people will come. And then other times, like, the Secretary of State's office, the Secretary of State of Vermont's like, hey, we should do a comic, and you're like, oh, great, and then, so 25,000 of these are going to be distributed throughout the state over the next couple months, which is super exciting, into schools, and talking about our FU comic. So I think I'm going to stop rambling. You've been very patient, and I'm happy to talk about anything that I've touched upon. How about you, and then how about you, and then we'll go over there.
I guess with your healthcare guide, especially since you were saying during a time we really had to do a lot of Zoom meetings and so forth, you're talking about podcasts and some of the reading you did. Were you able to conduct any field research into the kinds of folks who would actually need better use that, especially in more economically difficult communities and such, like folks who actually want to read that or need to know that information? And if so, did they have a chance to look at the guide? What were the responses?
Yeah, so we did share it, drafts far and wide, and each member of the team had, like, team members were kind of chosen for kind of a diversity of, granted they were all not all of them, but even though the majority of them went to an Ivy League school, like some were first generation Americans that were shared with families. Like one member of the team was the first, person to go to college, and how to help their parents who were sick who didn't speak English, navigate the U.S. healthcare system. So that kind of experience were in the team, and then a lot of the to make it a more practical guide. Several of the students kind of created like a user's, oh, you're going to the hospital. Here's a checklist of things that you should be thinking about to make that more just to prepare you for that as well. But did that answer your question or no?
Kind of. So I guess it was your people were kind of geographically based in different places that would talk to their family or friends or people.
Yeah.
Circle during that time. Did any of those folks have a chance, like some of these people's parents, for example, to see the guide, or were their responses maybe to it as far as its usability?
Yeah, I don't think we did that on that I felt with that project we had so many people working on it. I think there was a certain sense of like, okay, we're having various people read it. I shared it with cartoonists and various fellows who are working in public health, and we got that feedback. But for something like, for instance, like the mental health comic, like that was read by members of the community from Ohio and King County. When we did a Spanish edition, it was like read by their partners in the community to make sure that the translation was right and didn't feel too stiff. When we did the Freedom and Unity, and we're talking about, the different stakeholders in the history of Vermont, we made sure that it was read and vetted by people of the Abenaki tribe, for instance. So we do try with the health and wealth, maybe not as deliberately as some of the other projects. Yeah, but thank you for that question.
So with like healthcare, it's obviously sort of a controversial, big fun thing for everyone. And when you're making these educational comics, like how this whole thing works, how are you balancing, or are you trying to balance being like neutral in such a way that like more people want to read it versus like a commentary, like if you're using words like broken or whatever, like where maybe people who already know it is broken will be the only ones like absorbing. Does that make it?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. Right, like where
Where
does information become advocacy, sort of thing?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you going for?
Yeah. Well, in today, I mean, I could say, this wall is brown, and that's not brown. You know, like anything you say now can be, it seems like a partisan bomb that could go off. Even the most banal statements about any subject, but especially stuff in the public interest. Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, we try to be as quote unquote objective as possible. Like in the democracy comic, you know, at the end of the comic, there's somebody that talks about demagoguery, and if you don't get involved, this is what can kind of happen. And there's somebody you see from the back, but the way their hair looked like a certain orange person, and you know, like it's like why set yourself up for that, right? Like, so we changed the haircut, you know, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I do think there are just like certain moral issues at play, and you know, when you just what did Steinbeck say? Like the best way to condemn poverty is to like describe it or something along those lines. So we try to stick to a lot of facts and get as much right as we can, but at the end of the day, there is like some kind of moral imperative to all this stuff, and there is an element of advocacy for sure, you know. And
so kind of playing off that a little bit, most models of advocacy and activism kind of use a framework of framing a problem, providing solutions to a problem, and then implementation.
yeah,
It seems like these books are very heavy and very good at doing the problem framing, and then you touch a little bit on the solutions, and then implementation kind of you lead to an outside source using your books as a resource. Do you have any thoughts on using cartooning to more address the later parts of that stage, the solution, proposing solutions and implementing solutions?
yeah. I feel like when we start talking to like whether it's like the mikvah challenge or the, you know, Secretary of State's office or whatever, like we're creating as I said earlier, like these comics aren't the end all be all. They're part of an ecosystem that we're trying to figure out and map out, and then we're creating resources that are going to be helpful to other people. So and again, like I think that question about like the process of this, it's like it's such a work in progress, to be honest. And it's like there are times when I didn't vet as much and talk to as many people as I could have, and we're still kind of codifying this process, and every project's a little different. So like for instance, like this last spring, we actually did this exploratory seminar about doing a comic about mass incarceration, and you know, we gathered like, you know, 15 people, from like journalists to people who have been incarcerated to people who run reentry programs to cartoonists who were incarcerated. I mean, a real range of people, and said, you know, here's some of the things we've done. We'd like to do it for this project. What would this look like? What are we missing? What questions, you know? And that's really been helpful in trying to like frame that going forward by starting that process earlier. So yeah, we're learning as we go, for sure. But the goal also isn't like a comic can't do, you know, it has its limitations, and we feel like it is a resource to be used by other organizations, and we should check in with those organizations as we're making it. How about back there, and then Jared? Yeah, so I'm gonna repeat your question, just because I only heard. So, like, is it hard finding kind of collaborators, and how do you pay everybody? And yeah, that's also something we're figuring out as we go. Yeah, you have to pay everybody, you know. So what this model allows for, well, for one, is like we're making comic books, right? So it's a lot less costs up front in a way, like, and CCS, it's a 501c3, so we keep the copyright but we make the comic free to download. And we have a landing page for every comic, and people can download resources. And then we pay, of course, the cartoonists that are working on it. But the model with the Harvard students got paid like an hourly wage, and then CCS paid a CCS student. So people are being paid to create it as we go. And I think one of the things about this model too is there's some of these projects like the mental health and the reading, like an organization who saw some of these comics were like, hey, we want to help teachers teach people their students how to best practices about reading. And they fund it, they come with the funding. So I think it's like a lot of, some things you just kind of start and you hope you'll piece it together as you go along, and CCS can at least provide that initial seed thing to keep people being paying people, and then hopefully you find the funders. So if you're doing a comic about climate change or mass incarceration, I mean, there's so many foundations out there. But finding all that and pulling that together is a bit of an effort. But what's neat when you can work with young committed people, and they can do that research and help you. And I think it's a really cool learning experience. I mean, it's a great learning experience for me, that's for sure. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Jared.
Yeah, just
and then
quick question. I know with the Let's Talk About It, which I've shared with lots of people since that came out, I think it's terrific. That's also a project that's slightly different, right? I know that Carabine have been working on some related materials. How did that one come together? Did you get kind of asked to do that one?
Yeah, so there's one, a graphic guide to mental health, and the question was, how did the graphic guide to mental health come about? And so the Center for Cartoon Studies is a cartoon school in Vermont, and we have all these amazing students and visiting artists that come through, and we also have some fellowship programs. And we have a fellowship program that's actually in the former home of J.D. Salinger, that Harry Bliss, the great cartoonist, that's where his studio is, and there's a carriage house, and a cartoonist goes there for a month and works on a book. And there was a cartoonist, Carabine, and she was working on a big graphic novel that's going to, I think, hopefully come out next year about mental health for teens. So we were approached by that Stark County Health Board, and with a lot of this stuff, it's like, it's figuring out the right person to do the right project. And that was a no-brainer. Like, oh, if Kara could do this, like they've already done the homework. Like everything I went through the healthcare, it's like I knew nothing about healthcare. I mean, the students I was working with took more, some of them were pre-med or took history of healthcare classes. So like they knew a lot more than I did. Calling up Kara was like she had been thinking about it, writing about it, cartooning about it for like the last 10 years or whatever. So it was that one, was an easily slotted.
Did you have to vet a lot with Stark County, or did they largely stay out of it?
Well, we didn't want them to stay out of it, speaking to that point of making sure. So they looked at drafts and they weighed in. And again, you learn as you go. We had a translator that checked all the boxes, and I'm not fluent in Spanish by a long shot. So when it was time to then, here's the Spanish translation, and it's like, read it, and people were like, oh, this looks like Google Translate. What do we do now? And it was like, okay, how do we go back to figure it out so it's right? So with Kara, people who were going to be using it read it, and we got feedback and incorporated that feedback. And that was a little more streamlined because that was like plugging a cartoonist to do a specific job.
It's terrific resource.
Yeah, well, thank you. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious for you as a creator and a teacher, and I know you have other work that you do too, so just how you balance projects, like what your time and balance looks like working on projects like this versus working on other projects, and then also, I know you said you're teaching
Yeah, well, that's always a challenge, right? So, and it always changes year to year, month to month. I mean, when I was doing the Radcliffe Fellowship, I mean, that was what was nice is I could step away from my CCS's duties a little bit because I had funding from Radcliffe, and then I could just focus on the health and wealth for that year almost. I mean, that was like a front burner project. And I didn't have a real hardcore personal project at that point. Now I'm working on a more personal project, and what I try to do is just not schedule anything before like 11 or 11:30, and try to, some days that's aspirational, and it's like 15 minutes or 20 minutes of my own stuff, and some days it's like 2 or 3 hours. But if you can just keep the water moving through the pipes so that it doesn't get too rusty, that's what I aim for. But it is a challenge sometimes to do it. It's like it's hard to complain because it's like all the work. It feels. I'm grateful in for the collaborations, but it is hard to sometimes balance it all. And the cartoon school is like a tiny organization that's run by very few people. So we just got a grant from a foundation that's going to help us kind of try to set up an applied cartooning center, because that we can kind of broaden and deepen the work. Because like we're making this material that's getting well received, but like this mental health comic should be everywhere. We're in the middle of a crisis, and this is a great resource. But like you really need somebody to be like going out and like trying to get it into other schools, or the democracy comic, for instance. So, and people writing grants, and we're on one hand, we're able to kind of be very, as a small organization, a small school, we're able to be very responsive and try new things, and but we also don't have like a team of grant writers or some of the things that a larger organization would have. So we recently got a grant to try to start filling in a little of that, kind of launch a bit of an applied cartooning center where this kind of work can land, and we can kind of do some more of it. We have a few more graphic guides and various other projects, not only graphic guides in the works. So we'll see where that goes. All right. I think we're good. Thank you, everybody.